part of the allure of both drugs and entertainment is escape, yes, from my problems and my life and having to be stuck in here. I can, pretend I'm James Bond or pretend to. It just it seems fine over the short haul as a way of life. It doesn't work all that well, though. No.
David Foster Wallace is regarded as one of the most unique, talented, and perceptive writers of the late 20th and early 21st century. Wallace is especially renowned for his novel, Infinite Jest, released in 1996, which shook the literature world with its style, layers, humor, and insightful examinations of modern life. One of the primary themes of the novel is the nature of entertainment and its effects on the consumer, a theme that has only become more and more relevant since the release of the novel. When discussing this theme, Wallace proposed that media and entertainment have become so easy, so pleasurable, and so vast that they are more appealing than real life, which has a high potential of leading to an unhealthy addiction. At the time, he was primarily referring to television. However, it's fair to say that his thoughts also had some root in his expectations for the future. When writing and discussing these ideas in the 90s, Wallace had enough insight to predict things like Netflix and FaceTime, which would end up becoming true to a frightening degree of accuracy. Since Wallace's time, sadly having taken his life in 2008, technology and media have continued to progress at a disorienting rate, congruent with his predictions. We have a phone in our pocket at all times that connects us to essentially anything we want, whenever we want. Cell phone service and Wi-Fi is essentially everywhere. Social medias have become pervasive. Computers and laptops are commonplace for everyone of all ages. There are too many TV networks and streaming platforms to count. The amount of content being produced, broadcasted, and uploaded into the world is unending. It's fair to say that the concerns Wallace had decades ago are now more valid and critical than ever. It is not that entertainment is bad fundamentally. In fact, Wallace never explicitly felt or claimed that it was. Instead, however, he pointed out that the problem arises when a consumer loses self-control over their consumption and seeks constant, passive entertainment. He suggested that this loss of control is becoming increasingly hard to avoid because of modern entertainment's accessibility, commercialization, and addictive quality, making media and entertainment an easy yet risky drug of choice, one that we should perhaps be more careful with. Commercial entertainment's goal is to make money, and it makes money through distribution sales and/or advertising, which is dependent on viewership and viewer retention. This means entertainment has to be as accessible to as many people as possible in order to obtain viewers, and as pleasurable as possible to keep them coming back. Generally, in order for commercial entertainment to be successful in this, it has to be easy and fun. And what is easy is what requires nothing of the consumer and allows them to forget about the stresses and challenges of their life. As a result, entertainment has followed this path of least resistance, attending to the consumer's base desires for pleasure and ease. Consequently, entertainment in general has become increasingly mindless, numbing, and distracting, rather than complex, nuanced, and thought-provoking. Wallace contested, or at least questioned, the idea that the experience of life benefited much from pleasure at all. Being of a financially stable family in the United States, Wallace was afforded material comforts, higher education, and in his later years, some amount of fame and fortune. He had access to essentially as much pleasure as he wanted and obtained what some might regard as the American dream, and yet he remained deeply sad and lonely. Not only that, but he found that he was not unique in this feeling. In fact, he observed that the majority of his friends and acquaintances in similar circumstances also felt the same way, and generally, Western society at large felt the same way. This raises the question, how is it possible that people who appear to have everything one could want according to Western ideals feel very little on the inside? Wallace considered the possibility that we often confuse what we want with what we need and vice versa, and that by always giving in to our compulsions to feel pleasure, we're actually enslaving ourselves to our base nature and inhibiting any higher level of human experience. Wallace suggested that, in part, our tendency to do so was a result of being told by culture that we are special and we should serve ourselves above everything and anyone else. We should derive as much pleasure from life, we should consume as much media and entertainment as we can, buy as much stuff as we can, ingest as much substance as we can, be as famous and as wealthy as we can. We should want only to feel good all the time and turn away from anything that requires vulnerability, deep, challenging thought, sadness, or self-honesty. The problem is that things that burden us as humans are always vibrating inside us, and when we choose to pretend they aren't there by veiling them with distractions, we actually neglect to ever truly treat them, better understand ourselves, connect with others, and improve our life. We become sort of hypnotized by technology and entertainment and find ourselves just distracted enough to be comfortable in our discomfort. What does all this mean for us? Are we hopeless to be further consumed by consumption, destined to reside in a limbo of sadness, isolation, and dissatisfaction? It depends. It is not that smartphones, social media, the internet, television, etc. are bad. They can be very useful, and being entertained has its place in life. However, the problem is that too much of anything is by nature too much. And when something feels so much better than real life and provides so much pleasure, it becomes addictive. And when it becomes addictive, we tend to indulge too much. Like a drug or alcohol, it becomes an escape that we keep returning to, only to sanction us from ever addressing or caring to address the things that we are trying to escape from. Instead of dealing with life's stresses and problems in healthy ways, thinking about them, talking about them, expressing them, and facing them, we pretend that they don't exist and turn to something that is not sustainable or fundamentally helpful as a means of solution. We turn to the mindless entertainment and media on our phones, our TVs, and our computers. It is not hopeless though. Mass media and entertainment is a cultural phenomenon, but the consumption of it is an issue at the individual level. For many of us, we are in fact addicted. But like any form of addiction, there is hope for recovery. Admitting that one is addicted and not in control is typically the first step, and maybe that's a good place to start if we in fact are. At which point, we can begin to realize how healthy or unhealthy our choices are pertaining to what we consume and how often we consume it. In Wallace's case, he actually removed television from his home in order to combat his tendency to constantly watch it. We don't necessarily have to follow suit and entirely disconnect ourselves in the same way, because there are great benefits to engaging in media and entertainment. It is not all bad and passive. There are great shows, great movies, great YouTube channels, great websites, and so on. Ones that engage the viewer in ways that help them think, learn, consider, and develop. Content that makes the consumer feel less alone or actually address things that are difficult, sad, or honest, even if they're not always very entertaining. Instead of disconnecting entirely, perhaps approaching our consumption with some amount of intention is more realistic, similar to how one might be conscious of what they eat and drink. To curb an unhealthy diet, one does not stop eating, but instead, they eat healthier foods and perhaps less food. We can have our cheat days, but we should be careful and recognize the very real consequences of what media we consume and how much we consume of it. This is not to suggest that modifying and reducing our consumption is easy, but it is to suggest that perhaps it is serious and necessary if we want to be healthier, happier individuals. In life, there is value in effort, vulnerability, and selflessness. There's value in doing or watching things that make us work a little, or feel a little gloomy, or think a little bit more than we'd like. There are parts of life that aren't pleasurable, but rewarding. Parts where you don't feel special, but feel a part of a much bigger picture or community. Parts that aren't entertaining, but important. Perhaps what we can learn from Wallace is to remember this, to not always follow our desires for pleasure and ease, and instead, sometimes force ourselves to face our demons head on, to challenge ourselves, to try and connect with, understand, and improve the world around us, instead of always trying to escape it.